For a long moment, the only sound was the frantic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, each tick a hammer blow against the fragile silence. My mind, a whirlwind of disbelief, struggled to grasp the words. A nursing home. The phrase echoed in the hollow space that had just opened in my chest. It was a place for strangers, for the forgotten, for people who had no one. It was not for me. Not for Mary, the matriarch, the heart of this sprawling, noisy clan. Silver Creek Meadows, Susan, David's wife, said brightly, her voice jarringly cheerful. "We saw the brochure, Mary. It's more like a resort. They have water aerobics and a book club. You'd make so many new friends." Her words were meant to be soothing, I suppose, but they were salt in a raw wound. New friends. Did she think friends could be swapped out like worn-out furniture? Did she think the love and history contained within these walls could be replaced by a scheduled activity? I finally found my voice. It was a stranger's voice, thin and reedy. "But why?" I whispered, looking from one averted face to another. "Is my cooking not good enough anymore? Is the house too cluttered? Just tell me what I have done wrong, and I will fix it." It was the plea of a child, I know, but in that moment I felt as small and helpless as one. I was bargaining for my own life from the very people to whom I had given it. "Oh, Mother, don't be so dramatic," Eleanor sighed, the impatience clear in her tone. "This has nothing to do with you doing anything wrong. It is a practical matter. You are 80 years old. We have to be realistic." Realistic? The word ignited a spark of anger within me. Was it realistic when your father and I worked 3 jobs between us to keep this roof over your heads? Was it realistic when I stayed up all night sewing a dress for your school dance because we couldn't afford to buy one? Was it realistic to believe that all 10 of you could go to college? We weren't realistic, Eleanor. We were a family. We did what was necessary out of love. My gaze swept across the room and landed on the empty armchair at the head of the table. Arthur's chair. It had been empty for 5 years, but in that moment, I could see him sitting there as plain as day. His kind, crinkled eyes would have been blazing with a protective fire. I could almost hear his voice, a low rumble that always made me feel safe. "You're the heart of this home, Mary," he had told me on a rainy afternoon, long ago, as we sat watching the children play on the floor. "Without you, it's just timber and nails. You hold us all together." The memory was like a steel rod being inserted into my spine. I straightened up, the tremor in my hands subsiding. I was not just Mary, the bewildered old woman. I was Arthur's wife, and this was our home, a promise we had built together. David, ever the businessman, seemed to sense the shift in my resolve. He reached into his blazer and pulled out a slick, trifold brochure, its glossy pages depicting smiling, silver-haired seniors playing shuffleboard. He slid it across the polished wood towards me. The name Silver Creek Meadows was written in a cheerful, looping script beneath a picture of an unnaturally green lawn. "Just look at the facilities." "Mother," he urged, his voice taking on the tone of a salesman closing a deal. "It's state-of-the-art, 24-hour nursing care. They handle all the meals and the cleaning. You wouldn't have to lift a finger." He didn't understand. Lifting a finger was what my life was about. The weight of the dough under my palms, the heft of a grandchild in my arms, the effort of pulling a weed from my garden. These things were not burdens. They were proof that I was alive, that I was needed, that I was still here. I looked at the brochure, this cheap, impersonal summary of my supposed future, and then I looked at my son. I saw a stranger, a man who would trade his mother's home for convenience, who would measure her love in terms of cost and efficiency. With a calmness that surprised even myself, I placed my palm flat on the brochure and slowly pushed it back across the table toward him. "I will not look at it," I said, my voice low but carrying the weight of an unshakable conviction. "Because I am not going." A ripple of shock went through the room. This was not the reaction they had expected. They had anticipated tears, pleading, perhaps a confused, senile acceptance. They had not expected defiance. I rose from my chair, my joints aching in protest, but I stood tall. "This conversation is over," I announced, looking each of my children in the eye, one by one. "You have forgotten yourselves. You have forgotten what this family was built on. You came into my home, ate my food, and then you passed a sentence upon me as if I were a common criminal. There is no love in that. There is no honor." I paused, letting the words hang in the thick, uncomfortable air. "This lunch is over. I want you all to leave my house." The silence that followed was absolute. Then came the scraping of chairs, the clinking of hastily gathered silverware, the shushing of confused children. They left, not like a family departing after a pleasant meal, but like a defeated army retreating from a field they had expected to win without a fight. They fumbled with their coats and bags, avoiding my eyes, their faces a mixture of anger, guilt, and shock. As Samuel ushered his family out the door, little Clara broke free from his grasp. She ran back to me, her small face streaked with tears, and threw her arms around my legs, hugging me tightly. "I don't want you to go, Grandma," she sobbed into the fabric of my dress. "Please don't go." I knelt down, my bad knee screaming in protest, and cupped her tear-stained face in my hands. "Don't you worry, my sweet girl," I whispered, my own tears finally beginning to fall. "Grandma isn't going anywhere." I watched her go, then closed the heavy oak door behind them. I stood alone in the dining room, surrounded by the ruins of our Sunday lunch. The half-eaten plates, the crumpled napkins, the oppressive silence. I walked to Arthur's chair, ran my hand over the worn velvet of the armrest, and drew a deep, shuddering breath. The battle had been announced, and the opening shot had been fired. But the war for my home, for my dignity, had just begun. The days that followed were a study in silence. The phone on the wall, usually a source of constant, cheerful interruption, remained quiet. The sprawling emptiness of the house, once a comfort, now felt like a weight. I cleaned away the remnants of the disastrous lunch, scrubbing the plates with a vengeance, as if I could wash away the memory of the words spoken over them. With each plate stacked and each glass dried, my shock and grief began to cool, hardening into a quiet, cold resolve. They would not find me weeping in a corner. I was Mary, Arthur's wife, and the heart of this home did not beat weakly. I knew I could not wait for them to come to me. They had made their move as a pack, hiding their individual cowardice behind a collective decision. My only chance was to face the wolves one by one, to look into their eyes away from the safety of the group and force them to confront the woman they were trying to discard. I decided to start with David. His motive, I suspected, was the least complicated. David had always understood the world through the language of numbers, dollars and cents. On Tuesday morning, I put on my good navy blue coat, the one with the pearl buttons, and drove my old, steady Buick across town to the manicured suburb where David and Susan lived. Their house was a monument to their success, a large modern structure of glass and white stone, with a lawn so perfectly green it looked like a carpet. There was no clutter, no history, no soul. It was a house to be admired, not lived in. I rang the bell, my heart a steady, determined drum against my ribs. Susan opened the door, her perfectly made-up face collapsing into a mask of surprise. "Mary, what are you doing here?" she stammered, clutching the collar of her silk robe. "I've come to speak with my son," I said, my voice even. I walked past her into the marble entryway, my sensible shoes clicking on the cold, polished floor. The air smelled of lemon polish and something vaguely synthetic. David emerged from his home office, a phone pressed to his ear. He saw me and his face hardened. "I'll have to call you back," he muttered into the receiver and hung up. "Mother," he said, his tone a mixture of annoyance and caution. "You should have called." "Why?" I asked, turning to face them both in the cavernous white living room. "So you could have prepared your excuses?" "I'm not here to fight, David. I am here to understand. Look me in the eye and tell me why you believe your 80-year-old mother, who is in perfect health, should be removed from her home." They exchanged a quick, nervous glance. It was Susan who spoke first, falling back on the tired, rehearsed script. "Mary, we've been over this. We are worried sick about you. Your safety is our #1 priority." "Is it?" I asked calmly. "My doctor gave me a clean bill of health last month. My neighbor, Mr. Henderson, checks on me every single day. I have lived in that house for 55 years. I know every creak in the floorboards and every crooked step. Tell me, David, what specific danger am I in that is so great it requires me to be locked away?" David ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, his patience clearly wearing thin. He was a man who was used to getting his way, not to being questioned. "It's not just about safety, Mother. It's about quality of life. The upkeep on that old house is a fortune. The roof will need replacing soon. The furnace is ancient. It's a money pit, and that has always been my concern, not yours," I countered. "Your father and I paid that house off 30 years ago. I have my pension and our savings. I am not in debt. I have never asked you for a single penny for its upkeep." The truth was now cornered, and it had no choice but to show its face. "Exactly. David burst out, his voice rising. He began to pace the white rug, his frustration finally boiling over. That house is a major asset, Mother. A gold mine sitting there doing nothing. The property value in that neighborhood has skyrocketed. It's financially irresponsible to just let it sit there while you grow old in it. There it was, the cold, hard truth, stripped of all its flowery disguises about my safety and well-being. He stopped pacing and faced me, his eyes gleaming with the fervor of a man explaining a brilliant stock tip. Don't you see? If you sold it, you could live like a queen at Silver Creek Meadows. You'd have more money than you'd know what to do with, and the rest, the bulk of the inheritance. It could be put to work, invested, for the future of this family. He said family, but his eyes said me. He saw my home, the place where he took his first steps, as nothing more than a pile of money he couldn't touch. He was willing to trade his mother's peace of mind for a better investment portfolio. A wave of profound bottomless sorrow washed over me, a grief deeper than the one I felt at the lunch table. The anger was gone, replaced by a hollow ache. The little boy who collected shiny pebbles had grown into a man who couldn't see the value in anything that didn't shine like gold. I looked at him, at his expensive suit and his cold, sterile house, and I felt nothing but pity. My home is not an asset, David, I said, my voice soft with a sadness that seemed to fill the entire room. It is a legacy of love. It is my life. I am so sorry that you can no longer tell the difference. Without another word, I turned and walked out of their perfect, empty house. I didn't look back. As I drove away, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't a misguided act of concern. It was a coup, motivated by the oldest and ugliest of sins, greed, and I knew who my next visit had to be. Eleanor. Her motives were always more complex, wrapped in layers of pride and a desperate need for control. David wanted the money. But Eleanor wanted my surrender. The drive to Eleanor's house was shorter, through leafy streets lined with old oak trees and stately brick houses that spoke of quiet, established wealth. This was Eleanor's world, orderly, respectable, and predictable. I knew this confrontation would be harder than the one with David. Greed is a simple, ugly beast, but pride, Eleanor's particular brand of pride, masquerading as duty, is a fortress with 1,000 walls. Her home was exactly as I expected. A perfect colonial with black shutters and a brick walkway so pristine it looked as though no one ever dared to walk on it. Inside, the air was still and cool, smelling faintly of potpourri and beeswax. Every object was in its rightful place. The magazines on the coffee table were fanned out in a perfect overlapping crescent. The cushions on the sofa were plumped and angled just so. It was the home of a woman who waged a constant, successful war against chaos. Eleanor met me at the door, not with surprise, but with a tight-lipped disapproval. Her husband Robert hovered behind her, a faint apologetic smile on his face. "Mother," she said, her voice crisp, "driving around town by yourself like this? It's exactly this sort of impulsive behavior that worries us." She was already building her case, twisting my visit into another piece of evidence for her trial. "My driving is perfectly fine, Eleanor," I said, stepping inside. "I'm here to continue the conversation you started on Sunday. I've spoken to David. He made his reasons quite clear. They are about money. Now I want to hear yours." Robert flinched, but Eleanor's expression didn't flicker. She led me into the living room, a space that felt more like a museum exhibit than a place for family. "Sit down," she commanded, more than invited. "Robert, get Mother a glass of water." She waited until Robert had scurried off to the kitchen before she faced me. "First of all," she began, her tone that of a patient headmistress addressing a difficult child, "this has absolutely nothing to do with money. That is a vulgar accusation, and frankly, I'm disappointed in David for even discussing it. This is about what is responsible and what is right." "And what do you believe is right?" I asked, keeping my hands folded calmly in my lap. "What's right is ensuring you are properly cared for," she said, launching into her attack. She had been preparing for this. "Someone has to be the adult in this situation. Last month, you misplaced your checkbook and were convinced someone had stolen it. It took you an hour to find it in your recipe box. 2 weeks ago, you called me in a panic because you couldn't remember if you'd taken your blood pressure medication." She ticked off each infraction like a prosecutor listing charges, her memory sharp and cruel. She was taking the small, normal slips of an 80-year-old mind and weaving them into a tapestry of incompetence. She was trying to make me doubt myself, I let her finish, my heart growing heavier with each twisted memory. When she was done, a smug look of certainty on her face. I took a slow sip of the water Robert had placed beside me. The checkbook was in the recipe box because I had just paid the grocer. Eleanor, I said, my voice quiet and even. And I called you about my medication because the doctor had just changed the dosage and I wanted to be certain. I was not being senile. I was being careful. You see these things not as they are, but as you need them to be to prove your point. I leaned forward slightly, my gaze holding hers. This isn't about my memory, is it, my dear? It's about your fear, your father's illness. It frightened you. You couldn't control it. You couldn't organize it. You couldn't file it away in one of your neat little boxes. And now you look at me and you see old age. And you are terrified because you cannot control that either. A flicker of something, anger, or perhaps truth, flashed in her eyes. I continued, the words coming from a place of deep, sorrowful understanding. You can't stand the thought of me being independent, of me being messy. You can't control what I eat, when I sleep, or if I might one day fall. And because you cannot control me, you have decided you must contain me. Put me away in a clean, orderly place with a schedule and visiting hours. A place you can manage. This isn't for my good, Eleanor. It is for your peace of mind. The silence that followed was thick with the truth I had just spoken. Robert stood by the doorway, looking pale. Eleanor's face was a stony mask, but I could see the faint tremor in her jaw. I had bypassed all her walls and struck at the very heart of her. You have always been stubborn, she finally said, her voice trembling with a barely suppressed rage. You refuse to see reason. The family has made its decision. We are moving forward with or without your consent. You are not the head of this family, Eleanor, I replied softly, and you do not have the right to make a decision for me. I stood up, my visit concluded. I had learned what I came for. David was driven by greed. Eleanor was driven by a desperate, suffocating need for control. They were two sides of the same cold, loveless coin. As I walked to the door, I paused and looked back at my daughter, my firstborn, who looked at me now as if I were a problem to be solved. I pity you, Eleanor, I said, not with malice, but with a genuine ache in my heart. To live in a world where everything must be controlled is to live in a very small world indeed. I left her standing in her perfect, silent house. I had now faced the two heads of this serpent. The rest of my children were the body, weaker, more pliable, moved by the will of the head. But a body has a heart, and I had to believe that somewhere, in one of my other children, a heart was still beating with love and conscience. My thoughts turned to my youngest son, Benjamin. The gentle one, the artist. Surely he could not be a part of this. Surely his heart was not as cold as the others. 2 days passed before I felt strong enough to face the next battle. The encounters with David and Eleanor had been draining, each one chipping away a different piece of my heart. But Arthur's memory and Clara's tearful hug were my shield and my comfort. On Thursday, I drove toward the city, to the slightly chaotic, paint-splattered neighborhood where my youngest, Benjamin, lived with his wife, Sarah. Benjamin was my artist, my dreamer. He had always seen the world in hues and shades the rest of us missed. His heart was a gentle, sprawling thing, but it was not always a strong one. I knew he was easily swayed, his desire for peace often overriding his own convictions. I prayed that his convictions were still there, buried somewhere beneath the pressure from his siblings. His home was a small, charming bungalow, paint peeling slightly on the porch railing, with overflowing pots of geraniums flanking the door. Inside it was a beautiful creative chaos. Canvases leaned against the walls, some half-finished, others brilliant and complete. The air smelled of turpentine, coffee, and life. It was the only one of my children's homes that felt remotely like my own. Benjamin opened the door, and his face, when he saw me, was a portrait of misery. His shoulders slumped, and he couldn't meet my eyes. "Mother," he whispered, his voice thick with guilt. Sarah appeared behind him, her expression just as pained. She was a kind girl, a potter, with clay often smudged on her cheek. "Hello, Benjamin." "Hello, Sarah," I said gently. "May I come in?" They parted wordlessly, and I walked into their living room, my eyes taking in a new painting on the easel, a landscape of the creek behind my house, captured in the soft light of dawn. He had painted my home, even as he was agreeing to take it from me. The irony was a fresh, sharp pain. I sat on a worn armchair, and they sat opposite me on the sofa, perched on the edge as if ready to flee. I didn't want to attack him as I had the others. With Benjamin, my only weapon was the truth of my love. Benjamin, I began, my voice soft. I'm not here to scold you. I want you to look at me, really look at me, and tell me from your heart if you believe I am a woman who belongs in an institution. His eyes, when he finally lifted them to mine, were swimming with tears. He shook his head, a single violent motion of self-loathing. No, he choked out. No, Mother, I don't. Then why? I asked simply, and then it all came pouring out, a torrent of confession and guilt. He told me about the family meeting they'd had without me, how Eleanor had presented her list of my failures with grim finality, and how David had followed up with spreadsheets and financial projections, showing how much money they were all losing by letting the house sit there. Eleanor made it sound like we were being cruel if we didn't act. Benjamin mumbled, staring at his hands. She said if you fell and broke your hip, the guilt would be on all of us for not doing the responsible thing. And David, he said the market was at its peak. He offered to help me with the down payment for a real studio if the sale went through. He said it was for my own good, for my art. He was trapped, caught between Eleanor's fear-mongering and David's bribery, tangled in a web of obligation and his own financial insecurity. I hate myself for it, Mother, he whispered, his voice cracking. But I felt powerless. What could I do? Stand up to all of them? I felt a surge of love for this weak, beautiful son of mine. He had not betrayed me out of malice, but out of fear. Fear is a powerful cage, my love, I said, my voice full of an empathy that surprised me. And obligation is a heavy chain. I understand. Sarah, who had been silent, twisting a loose thread on her jeans, finally spoke. She placed a hand on her husband's knee. It's not right, Ben, she said, her voice quiet but firm. We both know it. Your mother, she's the glue of this family. Doing this it's like tearing the whole thing apart just to sell the pieces. Benjamin looked at his wife, and in his eyes, I saw a flicker of the strength he so often misplaced. He took a deep breath. Samuel's wife, Jessica, she didn't like it either, he admitted, as if revealing a great secret. She argued with Eleanor, said a family doesn't treat their mother like a business liability. Samuel made her back down, of course. He can't stand up to Eleanor either. A spark of hope ignited in my chest. So I was not entirely alone. Jessica, my quiet, observant daughter-in-law, had a conscience, and Sarah was on my side. The solid wall of their united front was beginning to show cracks. I stood up to leave, feeling lighter than I had in days. I walked over to Benjamin and placed a kiss on his forehead. You have a good wife, Benjamin, I said softly, and you have a good heart. I only ask that you listen to it. I gave Sarah's hand a squeeze of gratitude. Thank you, my dear, I whispered. As I left their messy, wonderful, art-filled home, I felt a shift in the wind. I was no longer just defending myself against a unified attack. Now I had a new mission. I was not just fighting a war. I was gathering an army. My next visit would be to Samuel and Jessica. I knew Samuel was consumed by a bitter envy that often made him cruel. But Jessica might be the key. For the first time since that terrible Sunday, I allowed myself to feel a fragile, trembling hope. The hope I felt after leaving Benjamin's home was a fragile thing, a tiny flame I had to shield with cupped hands against the harsh winds of reality. I knew my next visit would be the true test. Samuel, my third child, had lived his whole life in the shadow of his siblings, and that shadow had cultivated a bitterness in his soul as deep and tangled as the roots of an old dying tree. His envy was a constant low-grade fever, and I knew he had likely sided with David and Eleanor not out of conviction, but from a desperate need to finally be on what he perceived was the winning side. I arrived at their house on Saturday afternoon. It was a nice split level in a respectable neighborhood, but it always felt like a faint echo of David's grander home. The car in the driveway was a domestic model, not a luxury import. The landscaping was neat, but not professionally manicured. It was the home of a man who was perpetually trying to keep up. Jessica, my daughter-in-law, opened the door. The relief that washed over her face when she saw me was immediate and unmistakable, but it was quickly followed by a flicker of fear as she glanced back into the house. "Mary," she said in a hushed tone. "Come in." Samuel was in the living room, slouched in a recliner, watching a football game with the volume turned up loud. He glanced at me, his expression souring, and then deliberately turned his attention back to the television. What's she doing here? He called out to Jessica, as if I weren't even in the room. Jessica flinched. Your mother is here to visit, Samuel. Turn that down. I walked into the room, my presence forcing him to acknowledge me. He muted the television with a jab of his thumb on the remote, the sudden silence crackling with tension. I won't take much of your time, Samuel, I began. But I turned my body slightly, directing my next words to Jessica, who stood nervously by the doorway. Jessica, my dear, Benjamin told me that you spoke up for me at the meeting. He said you thought this plan was wrong. I came here today to thank you for that. Samuel shot out of his chair. Don't you dare, he snarled, his face flushing a deep mottled red. Don't you dare come into my house and try to turn my wife against me. You've been making your little rounds, haven't you? Playing the poor, pathetic victim. We made a decision, as a family. A family does not decide to dispose of its mother, Jessica said, her voice shaking but clear. She had found her courage. Samuel whirled on her. You stay out of this. No, she said, taking a step forward. I will not. This is my family too. He turned back to me, his eyes blazing with years of resentment. This is just like you, Mother. Always playing favorites, always manipulating things. David gets the business praise. Eleanor gets to be the responsible one. Benjamin gets coddled because he's the artist. What was ever good enough for me? Nothing. I've worked my fingers to the bone, and I'm still just Samuel, the one in the middle, the one no one ever notices. His pain, so raw and ugly, filled the room. It was the cry of a boy who had felt invisible his entire life. My heart broke for him, for the envy that had twisted him into this bitter stranger. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend myself. I simply spoke to the wounded child inside the angry man. Oh, my son, I said, my voice aching with a mother's sorrow. If you have ever, for one single moment of your life, felt that you were loved any less than the others, then that is my failing, and I am so deeply sorry. It was never in my heart for you to feel that way. I have always been so proud of you. The quiet sincerity of my words seemed to stun him. The anger in his posture deflated, leaving him looking lost and confused. He had expected a fight, an argument he could win. He was not prepared for an apology. In that moment of stunned silence, Jessica seized her chance. She walked to the center of the room, standing between us. A small woman made tall by her conviction. Mary is right to be sorry. Samuel, but not for the reason you think, she said. Her eyes locked on her husband. We should all be sorry. We sat at that table and let your brother and sister talk about your mother as if she were a piece of furniture they were tired of dusting. We let them weigh her life in dollars and convenience. That is not a family. That is a pack of wolves, and I will not let my children learn that this is how you treat the person who gave you everything. I will not be a part of it. Samuel stared at his wife, his mouth agape. He was trapped between the powerful siblings he so desperately wanted to impress and the undeniable moral force of his own wife. I knew I had what I came for. I walked over to Jessica and took both of her hands in mine. Thank you for your goodness, my dear, I whispered. It is a rare and precious thing. I looked at my son, who still stood speechless in the middle of his living room. I love you, Samuel, I said. And then I left them to face the truth that had finally been spoken aloud in their home. Driving home, the tiny flame of hope I'd been shielding had grown into a steady, warm glow. I had Sarah, I had Jessica, and I had Clara's unwavering love. It wasn't an army, not yet, but it was a start. The solid front had been broken. Now they were not a unified force, but a collection of fractured, guilty individuals. I knew what I had to do next. I would not visit any more of my children. I would not plead my case in their homes. The time for defense was over. It was time to summon them all back to mine, back to the heart of the family. The final battle would be fought on my ground. The rest of the week was spent in quiet preparation. It was not the bustling, joyful preparation of a Sunday lunch, but the solemn, deliberate preparation for war. My small alliance with Sarah and Jessica had given me the courage I needed. I would no longer be a pawn in their game. I would be the queen, and this was my castle. On Monday morning, I picked up the telephone and began to make the calls. I started with Eleanor. Eleanor, I said, my voice leaving no room for argument. There will be a family meeting at my house this Sunday at noon. It is not an invitation or a request. You will be here. I could hear her sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Well, I hardly think. I cut her off. You will be here, I repeated, and then I gently hung up the phone. One by one, I called them all. David was silent and cold. Samuel grumbled but agreed. The others, the quieter ones who had hidden in the shadows, sounded nervous and uncertain. When I called Benjamin, he simply said, "We'll be there, Mother." And I knew Sarah was standing beside him. With the summons delivered, I began to prepare my home. This time, there would be no cinnamon rolls, no slow-roasted chicken. The familiar, welcoming sense of my kitchen would be absent. I would offer them coffee, water, and the cold, hard truth. This was not a feast. It was a reckoning. I walked through the rooms of my house, gathering my evidence. Not papers or receipts, but memories. From the old cedar chest in the attic, I took out a small, lopsided clay pot, the first thing David ever made in art class. His small thumbprint still visible on the rim. I placed it on the mantelpiece. Beside it, I set the framed program from Eleanor's first piano recital, the paper yellowed with age, her name written in my best cursive. I found Samuel's Little League trophy, a small golden figure on a plastic base, and polished it until it gleamed. I went through the photo albums, selecting specific images. A photo of me teaching a 5-year-old Benjamin how to ride his bicycle, my hands steady on the back of the seat. A picture of the whole family on the porch, the summer before the youngest twins went to college, everyone squinting in the sun, a chaotic, happy tangle of arms and smiles. I laid the open albums on the coffee table. My house would speak for me. Its walls, its objects, its captured moments, they would all bear witness. On Saturday evening, I sat in Arthur's chair in the quiet living room. The house was clean, orderly, and waiting. I felt a deep, profound calm settle over me. I was not afraid. I had faced their greed, their pride, and their weakness. I had felt the crushing weight of their betrayal, but I had not broken. I thought of Arthur, of the life we built and the promises we made. I was ready to honor them. Sunday arrived, a gray, overcast day. At precisely noon, the cars began to pull up. They came in not with the cheerful clamor of a family gathering, but with the somber quiet of a funeral procession. They filed into the living room, their faces tense, avoiding each other's eyes as much as they avoided mine. David and Eleanor, the generals of this coup, sat together on the sofa, a united front of defiance. Samuel slumped in a chair, refusing to look at his wife Jessica, who had chosen to sit beside Sarah and a pale, nervous Benjamin. They were my small block of dissent, and their quiet solidarity gave me strength. The other children and their spouses filled the remaining seats, their discomfort palpable. I let them all settle, the silence stretching until it was almost unbearable. Then I rose from Arthur's chair, the symbolic head of the table, the seat of authority. I stood before them, not as their victim, but as their matriarch. "Thank you for coming," I began, my voice calm and clear, echoing slightly in the quiet room. "Last Sunday at my dinner table, most of you came to a decision about my life. You decided that my time in my own home was over. You decided where I would go, how I would live, and you did it all without the courtesy of speaking to me first." I paused, my gaze sweeping over each of their faces. "You came here today, I imagine, to finalize your plan. But you are mistaken. I did not summon you here to listen to your decision. I summoned you here to listen to mine." A ripple of shock moved through the room. This was not how they had envisioned this. I had seized control. "I have spent this past week understanding what led us to this point," I continued, my voice steady. "I have come to learn that this was never about my safety or my well-being, as some of you so piously claimed. No, this was about other things. It was about greed, and it was about fear. It was about the ugly, sad things that have taken root in this family when you thought I wasn't looking." I let the words land, letting them feel the full weight of the accusation. The final battle had begun. I let my gaze rest on David first, and then I pointed a slightly trembling finger toward the lopsided clay pot on the mantelpiece. "David," I said, my voice resonating with a sorrowful clarity, "you see this house as numbers on a ledger, an asset to be liquidated. But do you remember the little boy with clay smudged on his cheeks who made that pot? He ran all the way home from school, so afraid he would drop it. He wasn't thinking about its future market value. He was thinking only of the joy it would bring his mother. That little boy knew the vast difference between price and value. I have to wonder what he would think of the man you've become, a man who would auction off his mother's heart for a better return on his investment." David's face went rigid, a muscle twitching in his jaw. I turned to Eleanor. My eyes drifted to the yellowed recital program. "And you, Eleanor, you see me as a liability. A problem to be managed and filed away. You've been collecting my small forgetfulnesses like they are evidence for a trial, to justify your desperate need for control. Do you remember that little girl in the starched pink dress? Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely find the keys on the piano. But she played. She was brave. She wasn't afraid of a few wrong notes, of being less than perfect. Where did that brave girl go?
Why is she now a woman so terrified of anything in her life that she cannot neatly control?
Eleanor's mask of composure cracked. For the first time, she looked truly wounded. My gaze found Samuel, and I gestured toward his old trophy. And you, my Samuel, you are drowning in bitterness, convinced you were always left in the shadows. But I remember a boy on the baseball field who was the loudest voice in the dugout, a boy who clapped for his teammates harder than he clapped for himself. You found joy in the success of others, a joy your envy has long since stolen from you. Finally, I looked at the others, the silent, complicit ones, and to the rest of you, who sat in my home and listened to this plan. Your silence was your vote. Your cowardice was your consent. You let your brother and sister lead you down this dark path because it was easier than standing up for what every one of you knows in your soul to be right. This is nothing but emotional blackmail. Eleanor finally spat, finding her voice. You are twisting our concern into, no. The voice was not mine. It was Jessica's. She stood up, her hands clasped in front of her, her face pale but resolute. She's not twisting anything. She's telling the truth. We have been a disgrace. We talked about her as if she wasn't here, as if her feelings didn't matter. We are the ones who should be ashamed. Jessica's right, Sarah said softly, standing up beside her. Benjamin, looking at his wife's courage, slowly, agonizingly, got to his feet as well. I'm so sorry, Mom. We've been cowards. I've been a coward. The room was now divided. The three of them stood as a small island of loyalty in a sea of guilt and anger. I held up a hand, silencing the arguments that were about to erupt. Your apologies are heard, my children. But the damage has been done. A trust has been shattered. And so, as I told you, I have made my own decision. I took a deep breath, the words I had practiced in the dark of the night now ready. My decision is this. This house is no longer your inheritance. A collective gasp sucked the air from the room. David went white with fury. You can't do that, he choked out. Oh, but I can, I said calmly. I already have. An inheritance is a gift, a final act of love. It is not a right. It must be earned with respect and kindness, qualities that have been in very short supply. You have shown me you are not worthy stewards of this legacy. Therefore, I have met with a lawyer. Upon my death, the entire value of this house will be placed in a trust. That trust will be used to create college scholarships for underprivileged children who dream of a better life. Perhaps it will help build families that still understand what the word means. I let that sink in before delivering the final part of my verdict. As for me, I am going nowhere. I will live out the rest of my days in this home, surrounded by the memories I built with your father. But the terms of our relationship have now changed. The open door policy, the weekly Sunday lunches, they are over. My door and my heart will remain open to those who have shown me love. To Benjamin and Sarah, to Samuel and Jessica, if you can find your way back to kindness. To my sweet granddaughter Clara, and any of my other grandchildren who wish to see their grandmother. I will arrange to see them on my own terms. I looked directly at David and Eleanor, and then at the others who had remained silent. To the rest of you, my door is closed. You are my children, and I will always love you, but I will not allow you to hurt me again. You may call, you may write letters, but you will not enter this home again until you have done the long, hard work of remembering what it means to be a son, a daughter, a decent human being. You must earn back the privilege. The finality of my words hung in the air like a judgment. The war was over. I had not just defended my home. I had reclaimed my life. I stood before them, not as the frail old woman they had sentenced to exile, but as the judge who had sentenced them to an exile of their own making, banishing them from the heart of the very family they had tried to tear apart. Mother Mary Jim, personalizado, mostrar raciocinio. No one moved. The air in the room was thick with the wreckage of their expectations. My words, my decision, had detonated in the center of their lives, and they were all stunned by the blast. David was the first to recover, his shock curdling into a white-hot rage. He shot to his feet, his face contorted. You'll regret this, Mother, he hissed, his voice low and venomous. When you're old and truly alone, you'll remember this day and the fortune you threw away. He grabbed Susan's arm and stormed out of the house, slamming the oak door so hard that the little clay pot on the mantel rattled. Eleanor rose next, her movements stiff and regal, though her face was ashen. She looked at me, not with anger, but with a cold, devastating finality, as if I were already dead to her. "I was only ever trying to do what was best," she said, the lie sounding thin and hollow even to her own ears. She and Robert followed David out into the gray afternoon. The others began to shuffle out, a herd of shamefaced sheep. They couldn't look at me. They couldn't look at each other. They mumbled goodbyes to the floorboards and scurried away from the scene of their great moral failure. Samuel hesitated, his eyes darting from the closing door to his wife. Jessica went to him and took his hand. "We're going home, Sam," she said softly, but her tone made it clear it was not a suggestion. She looked at me over his shoulder and gave a small, tearful nod before leading her conflicted husband away. Soon, only Benjamin and Sarah remained. They came to me, and Benjamin wrapped his arms around me in a hug that was full of the sorrow and relief of a lifetime. "I am so sorry, Mom," he wept into my shoulder, "for everything." "I know, my love," I whispered, patting his back. I know. When they had gone, I was finally alone. I walked slowly to the door and locked it. The click of the bolt was a sound of profound significance. For the first time in my life, I was locking my family out. But for the first time in years, I felt like I was locking myself in, safe. The silence that filled my home was no longer the heavy, waiting silence of the past week. It was a clean, quiet peace, my peace. I had purchased it at a terrible price, but it was mine. I sat in Arthur's chair, the worn velvet of familiar comfort, and let the tears come. I wept for the children I had lost, the strangers they had become. I wept for the beautiful family we had once been. And when the grief had washed through me, I felt a quiet strength settle in its place. I had survived. Life found a new rhythm in the weeks that followed. A quieter, gentler rhythm. The phone still rang, but now it was Jessica calling to ask for my biscuit recipe, or Sarah wanting to tell me about a new art exhibit. The doorbell still chimed, but it announced Benjamin dropping by with his children, or little Clara, whose parents now let her visit on her own, a silent admission of their shame. My Sundays changed most of all. The frantic 10-child feast was replaced by a small, relaxed gathering. Benjamin and his family, Jessica and hers. Samuel came too. He was quiet, humbled, and spent most of his time watching his wife and his mother talking, as if trying to relearn a language he had long forgotten. We would sit around the old mahogany table, but it was no longer a courtroom. It was a haven. The laughter was real, the conversation easy. We were fewer, but we were more of a family than we had been in years. One afternoon, a letter arrived with Eleanor's handwriting on it. It was full of justifications, of sentences that began with, "I only wanted," and "if you had just listened." There was no apology, no accountability. I read it, felt a familiar pang of sadness for the daughter I had, and then I put it away in a drawer. The ball was in her court, but I was no longer waiting by the net. My new life, the one I had chosen, was full. It was full of teaching Clara to bake, of watching Benjamin's sons build forts in the living room, of long, honest talks with Jessica and Sarah. My love for my children had not died, but it had transformed. It was no longer a blind, all-consuming fire that allowed itself to be used for warmth by others, leaving me cold. It was now a hearth, a steady, contained flame to which only those who respected it were invited. This evening I sit on my porch swing, a soft quilt over my lap. The sun is setting, painting the sky in strokes of lavender and gold. Clara is beside me, her head resting on my shoulder, humming a little tune. From inside, I can hear the sound of my family, my real family, laughing as they wash the dinner dishes. I did not get the ending I always dreamed of, a sprawling, happy table with all my children gathered round. I received something far more precious instead. I learned that the greatest inheritance you can leave is not a house or money, but the example of a life lived with dignity, and that true love does not require you to sacrifice your soul. It only asks that you respect your own. Thank you for sitting with me through this painful memory. It means the world to share the burden and the triumph. If this story resonated with you, please show your support with a like and subscribe to my channel so you don't miss what comes next. I love reading your comments and feeling our community grow. What did you think of the choice I made? And which of my children's stories are you most curious to hear next? The journey of Samuel's envy? The cold ambition of David? Let me know in the comments below. Your curiosity helps me decide which memory to unlock next time.